Cape Byron Distillery recently ran out of batch 2 of their Chardonnay Cask Whisky and moved on to releasing batch 3. Fortunately, I have both. So I'm going to compare these whiskies and see how batch 2 and 3 differ, if at all, and also talk a little bit about why some whisky distilleries will advertise having different batches. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whisky enthusiast and I love all things whisky. Now, taste is subjective, and there's a lot of whiskies out there and a lot of different ways to enjoy them. So whether you're a whisky connoisseur or you just want to explore a little bit more about whisky, let's go through it together. Now, if you'd like to see more from me, please consider subscribing. I put up new videos every week. You can also follow me over on Instagram. I've been to a few Cape Byron tastings now, including a tour of the distillery, which you can actually catch here. While this is an Australian whisky distillery, owned and run by Eddie Brook, it's also co-owned and co-founded by Jim McEwan. If the name Jim McEwan sounds familiar, it's because he's one of Scotland's most awarded master distillers. He spent a massive 38-year career at Bowmore Distillery, before then being the distiller behind reinvigorating the stills at Brooklartic and getting that distillery up and running again in 2001. He's the creator of the delicious Octomore series, as well as several other big names at the Brooklartic Distillery. He is the only distiller in the world to have won the Master Distiller of the Year 3 times, and in 2014 he received a Whisky Hall of Fame Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, if you're interested in how a Scottish icon like that somehow managed to get involved in a little whisky distillery in Byron Bay, you can head to the distillery's website. They've got a lot more information about that. I'll put the link in the description below. Now, when it comes to this whiskey, the wort is actually made at the Stone and Wood Beer Brewery, which is just down the road from the distillery. Now, if you don't know what wort is, it's sort of the first stage of the liquid process of making whiskey. So it's where those malted barley grains are added and mixed in with water to get those sugars and the malt into a water that can then be fermented. So while the wort is made at the Stone and Wood Brewery, it's then moved over to the distillery and put into their 2,000 litre closed fermentation tanks, where they put their combination of different yeasts in to ferment. From here it's double distilled and then moved into a combination of bourbon barrels, and then there's 3 different Chardonnay casks they use. Now, they wouldn't tell me which wineries they actually get them from. They would only confirm that the barrels came from wineries from the Margaret River, Hunter Valley and Adelaide Hills. I know no more than that, and I don't think anyone ever will. Now, while red wine casks are a popular choice for aging Australian whisky in these days, Jim and Eddie decided to try first off with white wine casks. And the reason for that is just that red wine casks, in the high heat that you've got in Australia, they can impart a lot more tannins and a little bit more of those bitter notes that can be a little bit more difficult to control. So they wanted to start off with something like white wine because the end result was a little bit more manageable, gave them a chance to experiment a little bit more with the Australian whisky. Now, there are a couple of really important differences to note when it comes to Cape Byron Distillery, and the first of which is that all of their whisky is aged at least 3 years. Now, this isn't different for Scottish standards, but in Australia, we actually only have to age our spirit for 2 years in casks before we can call it whisky. And this is because the aging process in Australia happens a lot faster. It's a lot hotter climate, it happens a lot faster, and something like a 2 or 3 year old whiskey that's aged here can often end up tasting as complex as a 4 or 6 year old whiskey aged in Scotland. It just ages faster in the warmer climate compared to the cooler, more temperate climate over in Scotland. So although we only have to age our whiskey for 2 years here, Jim and Eddie decided to try and keep a little bit more truthful to the Scottish style and make sure that all of Cape Byron's distillery whiskies are aged for at least 3 years. The second difference is that when we're talking about these Chardonnay casks, often when a whiskey label says that it's a Chardonnay cask whisky, that'll be a finish. So that means that the whiskey was aged in something standard that the distillery usually uses, like bourbon casks or virgin oak, and then they'll finish the whiskey, which means pulling the whiskey out of those barrels, putting them into some other barrels, just to finish, just to add some extra flavour. Whereas the Chardonnay cask whiskies from Cape Byron Distillery spent their entire time in those Chardonnay casks. Now, those Chardonnay casks were mixed with a little bit of bourbon cask, but any whiskey that was in a Chardonnay cask spent its entire aging time in there, which is a point of difference when it comes to a whiskey. And finally, the Chardonnay cask expression, they are all 48% ABV. And the only reason for that is because Jim McEwan was born in 1948 and he wanted to put a little bit more of a signature on the bottle because his name was not enough. I can't argue with that really. So this is the batch 2 that I just recently picked up at the distillery. And I was really lucky to get a hold of this because it's one of the last, well, in fact I think it is, at the time it was one of the last batch 2s. But now there are none left. So that's it, that's the Chardonnay cask. So in case I forget which one's which, remind me that batch 2 is on this side. While I haven't bought a bottle yet, I was only just recently at a whiskey tasting where we had batch 3 and the reps were good enough to let me take a sample away home so I could do this comparison. So remember, this is batch 2 and this is batch 3. If you look at the colours, they're almost identical really. I'm seeing it's a golden sort of colour and very similar legs. Yeah, on appearance, there's not really much difference between these two. And another thing worth noting is Cape Byron Distillery, they're pretty adamant that they do not add any colouring to their whiskey, and they definitely don't chill filter, nor will they ever. Yeah, these are identical in appearance. I'm going to start with batch 2 because it's the one I know. So on the nose, I'm getting sort of like a little bit of a faint sweetness, but I'm probably getting a little bit more wood notes. Yeah, that's sort of, it's wood with a little bit of like a honeyed sort of sweetness in the background. Whereas the batch 3, the new one, this one seems to actually have a little bit more of a floral note to it. It's still got that woody sort of scent and a little bit of that sweetness in the background, but while the sweetness of batch 2 was more of a honeyed sort of sweetness, it's got a little edge of floral notes. Not quite citrus. Yeah, sort of like a little bit more of, almost like a potpourri sort of floral sweetness. Straight off the cuff, they are a little bit different. So now to taste batch 2. So straight away, what you're getting here is probably the first thing I noticed, other than just those wood and sweet notes coming across on the palate, is that there's this real buttery sort of mouthfeel. It's a wonderful texture, and that sweetness that carries in, it is more of a dry sweetness, the sort of thing that you're going to get from a white wine cask. But yeah, those wood notes are very prevalent. Those wood notes are very prevalent. And then the finish is a little bit quick, but it is just that fading, buttery. The most characteristic part of this is that buttery texture and those wood sort of flavors. And the finish is a little bit short. It does sort of dissipate rather quickly. You can still kind of taste it there on the palate, but the bulk of it disappears kind of quick. Okay, now, batch 3. Okay, that's interesting. That wood that is so prevalent on batch 2 is dialed back quite a bit on batch 3. So it does allow a little bit more of, it's not sweeter, but it allows more of the subtle flavors that associate with that sweetness to come through as well. So as I said, the floral notes, yeah, it's still floral. I still wouldn't call it fruit sort of sweetness. The wood's not as overpowering. This is actually a lighter whiskey. I have to admit, I'm surprised. I was thinking that these were going to be a lot more similar than that, but one of the other things here is because the wood is so prevalent in batch 2 that I'm actually starting to taste a little bit more of the malt from the whiskey itself coming through on this one. That's fantastic. I'm really happy that these are so different. You might be wondering why some distilleries do advertise or just put on the label that they've got different batches. Now, these were both made in very much the same way and released only about a year apart. So the question would be, why would you even call them different batches? Why wouldn't you just say it's the same thing? But a larger distillery, for instance, like say the Glenlivet, they've got hundreds of barrels to work with. So when they're releasing something like the Founder's Reserve, which is it's an ongoing whiskey they keep on releasing, every single year they release it, they've got enough barrels to play around with the flavor to make it taste exactly the same as it did in the last batch and the one before. So that anytime you want to get yourself a bottle of Founder's Reserve, you don't need to worry about what year it was made because it's always going to taste the same. Now with a smaller distillery or one that's sort of up and coming, they're working with a lot less barrels. So for instance, with these ones, I think we were told there were only about 4 or 5 200-litre barrels that went into making this whiskey. So you've got a lot less to play with. So even though it's made in exactly the same way, just the fact that they're in different barrels, different wood, slightly different temperatures in the warehouse, you're going to get a slightly different whiskey. So actually at least stating that whether it's batch 1, 2 or 3, it at least manages those expectations. For instance, if they were just calling this the exact same whiskey and I really, really liked the wood notes on batch 2 and then wanted to buy another bottle specifically to get that flavor profile, I would probably be a little bit disappointed having gotten batch 3. But knowing that these are not meant to taste exactly the same, you at least know what you're going to get. You're not going to be disappointed if one's a little bit different. It's just, if anything, it's sort of more of a journey, which is it's a huge part of what I like about whiskey. It's exploring other whiskeys, exploring other flavors, and even just exploring how the exact same whiskey made in the exact same way can taste different from batch 2 to batch 3. Now, when it comes to these batches, I mentioned earlier that batch 2 is sold out, and which is why they've released batch 3. There is not going to be a batch 4. They're not going to be doing Chardonnay casks, at least for a few years yet. So if you want to get a hold of the batch 3, this is your last chance to do it. There's only about 620 bottles, so time's running out. Now they've said they may do Chardonnay cask again, but if they do them again in future, they're not going to be doing them as full aging time in the Chardonnay casks. They'll be doing Chardonnay finishes this time around, just because, again, it's just a little bit easier to control the output. So if you are interested in trying the Chardonnay cask where the entire whiskey was aged just in Chardonnay, batch 3 is your only chance. It is a nice whiskey. And if you're watching from the US, Eddie Brook from the distillery is actually over in the United States at the moment, launching the Brookies Gin, which is a wonderful gin that they actually also make at Cape Byron Distillery. And it's made with something like about 17 native Australian botanicals that come directly from the rainforest of the distillery. I'm not the biggest gin drinker, but I definitely do like that. If you like gin, it's worth a look. Unfortunately, the whiskey is not going to be released in America anytime soon. And that's because they really want to concentrate on the Australian market with that and make sure that they can cater to the Australian market before they start expanding into something like the US. They are going to get there one day, but not yet. For now, it's just us, sorry. Now, as an Australian whiskey drinker, it's really important for me to support the Australian whiskey industry. So if you know of any Australian whiskies or distilleries that are worth looking into that you'd like me to do a video on, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe button. Enjoy what's in your glass. And that one's nearly empty. Enjoy what's in your glass and slange. There really is so much more wood in the batch too.